Okay, so get this.
Yeah.
Remember back when companies could just kind of sweep their climate impact under the rug?
Right.
Like nobody was watching?
Yeah.
Well, those days
are over.
are officially over.
Yeah.
We are in a whole new ballgame now.
Totally.
We are talking about mandatory climate disclosures.
Yes.
The kind that can make or break a company's future.
Absolutely.
And we asked you to send in some stuff about this because it's obviously a really hot topic.
It is a hot topic.
And you guys sent us a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's clear that this is not just a trend, it is a tidal wave.
Definitely a tidal wave.
I mean, get this, almost 40% of the global economy will soon be covered by these new rules.
It's a big shift.
That's huge.
Yeah, for sure. And what I think is really fascinating about this is it's a shift from like voluntary to mandatory.
Right.
So for years, companies could choose to report on their climate impact, or not.
Right.
But now regulators around the world are saying,
Right.
Nope, this is too important to be optional. Yeah.
Why the sudden urgency? Like what's changed?
I think the big realization is that climate risk is financial risk.
Okay.
So the U.S., for example, is finally acknowledging that climate change can impact a company's bottom line.
Yeah.
Just as much as like a supply chain disruption.
Right.
Or a change in interest rates.
So it's not just about saving the planet anymore.
Right.
It's about protecting investments too.
Exactly. Investors are increasingly demanding this information.
Interesting.
They want to know which companies are prepared for a changing climate and which ones are lagging behind.
So this is huge for anyone listening who's maybe prepping for a meeting with a sustainability-minded client.
Right.
Or just trying to keep up with the latest business trends, because this is it.
It's a big deal.
This is where it's at.
It is.
So let's dive into the specifics, and I think maybe a good place to start is what's happening here in the U.S.
Okay. So the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission,
the SEC,
they have finally released their long-awaited climate disclosure rules.
It's been a long time coming.
It has been a long road, lots of back and forth, but these rules are finally here.
They're here.
They are.
So what's the gist?
Yeah.
What are companies actually required to disclose?
Well, one of the big things is greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay.
So they have to report their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions.
Now, for those of us who haven't memorized all the scope terminology, remind us what those are again.
Of course.
Please.
So Scope 1 covers emissions directly from a company's operations.
Okay.
So think factories, company vehicles, that kind of thing.
Got it.
Scope 2 is about emissions from the energy that they buy.
Okay.
Like electricity.
So that's all the emissions that they have direct control over.
Exactly.
But what about all the emissions that happen like further down the line?
Yeah.
Like from their suppliers or the products that they sell?
So that's Scope 3.
Scope 3.
And that's where things get a bit trickier. The SEC decided to not require companies to report on Scope 3 emissions. At least not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Why not?
Well, there were a lot of concerns from companies about the complexity and the cost of tracking Scope 3 emissions.
Right, because we're talking about emissions from their entire value chain.
The entire value chain, which can be incredibly complex.
Yeah, I can see how that would be very difficult.
Yeah.
But doesn't that create a loophole, though?
It's a good point.
Where companies can essentially be hiding their true climate impact.
It's definitely a major point of criticism.
Yeah.
Some argue it's like saying you only have to clean up half your mess.
Right. So what does this mean for investors then?
Yeah.
Can they still get a clear picture of a company's climate risk?
It definitely limits the picture.
Yeah.
A lot of investors are already demanding Scope 3 data because they recognize that those emissions can pose huge financial risks.
Okay.
So for example, imagine a clothing company that's heavily reliant on factories with terrible environmental practices. Investors need to know about those risks.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So it sounds like even though the SEC isn't mandating it, a lot of companies might start doing it anyway just to stay competitive.
Exactly.
And appease investors.
And there's also pressure from other jurisdictions, like the EU, where reporting requirements are often much stricter.
Oh, interesting.
Speaking of which, you want to jump across the pond and see what's happening over there?
Let's do it, because the EU seems to be light years ahead of us.
Yeah.
On this whole climate disclosure thing.
They've been working on this for a while.
What are they doing differently?
So the EU has a really comprehensive framework in place.
Okay.
With 3 main directives that all work together.
Okay.
The EU taxonomy, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive.
The CSB.
GSDD.
Okay, so let's break those down. First, what's the EU taxonomy all about?
So think of it like a giant dictionary of sustainable activities. Right. It defines which economic activities can be considered environmentally sustainable within the EU.
Interesting.
And this helps investors and companies make more informed decisions about where to put their money.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the CSRD?
Yeah.
That's the one I hear the most buzz about.
Rightly so.
Why is that?
It's the real powerhouse when it comes to climate disclosures.
Okay.
It's the most comprehensive global mandate out there, and it's raising the bar for companies worldwide.
So what makes it so different from what the U.S. is doing?
Well, for starters, it covers a much broader range of issues than just climate change.
Okay.
So it requires companies to report on their social and governance performance, as well as their environmental impact.
So it's not just about the carbon emissions. It's about how a company treats its workers, its supply chain, the communities it operates in.
Exactly. It takes a more holistic view of sustainability.
Okay.
And perhaps the biggest difference is this concept of double materiality.
Okay, you've said that term a couple times now.
Yeah.
I think it's time to unpack it.
Okay, let's unpack it.
What is double materiality?
Yeah.
And why is it such a big deal?
In a nutshell, it means that companies have to consider two sides of the coin.
Okay.
First, how climate change and other sustainability issues impact their business.
Right.
So that's kind of the traditional single materiality approach that the U.S. is focused on.
Yeah.
But second, they also have to disclose their impact on the planet and people.
Okay.
Regardless of whether it directly affects their bottom line.
So it's not just about protecting profits.
Right.
It's about recognizing their responsibility to the wider world.
That's it.
Interesting.
And it's a huge shift in thinking.
Yeah.
So let's say there's a company that's polluting a river or exploiting its workers.
Okay.
Under the U.S. approach, they might not have to disclose that if it doesn't directly impact their profits.
Right. So it's all about their bottom line.
Exactly.
But with double materiality,
yeah,
they would have to come clean regardless.
Exactly. It's about transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
The EU is saying that companies can't just sweep their negative impacts under the rug,
right?
Even if it's technically legal or it doesn't hurt their bottom line.
Wow, that's pretty groundbreaking. It seems like the EU is really pushing the boundaries of what it means for companies to be responsible.
They are.
So what does this mean for U.S. companies that do business in Europe?
Yeah.
Are they going to have to comply with these tougher standards?
If they're large enough and operating in the EU, yes. The CSRD doesn't just apply to European companies. It applies to all large companies doing business within the EU market.
Wow, that's a pretty wide reach.
Yeah.
So are we seeing U.S. companies scrambling to catch up to these European standards?
Some are, especially those that are already focused on sustainability.
Okay.
But there's still a lot of resistance from companies that see these disclosures as a burden.
Yeah.
Just a bunch of extra paperwork.
Right. And I get that it can seem overwhelming, especially for companies that are like new to this whole world of climate reporting.
Right.
But haven't there been efforts to streamline the process and make it more manageable?
Absolutely. There's been a big push to consolidate different reporting frameworks and make the process more efficient.
I've heard a lot about the ISFB.
Yeah.
What's their role in all of this?
So the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, has been a game changer.
Okay.
They're essentially creating a global baseline for sustainability reporting by merging various existing frameworks, including the TCFD, which a lot of these mandatory disclosures are based on.
So it's like they're creating a universal language for climate data.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's a huge win for companies.
Right.
Because it means they don't have to jump through a million different hoops and report the same information 10 different ways.
Yeah.
The ISSB is making things more standardized and comparable.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if I'm a company and I have to report under both the US SEC rules and the EU's CSRD, is there going to be like a lot of overlap?
There will be, and that's by design. Okay. The ISSB framework has been really influential in shaping these mandatory disclosures, so you'll find many common elements.
So it's not double the work.
Right.
It's more like smarter work.
Smarter work, you got it.
Good.
And that's one of the things that the SEC emphasizes.
Okay.
They've built flexibility into their rules to accommodate these international standards and lessen the burden on companies.
That's good news.
It is.
Good news for everybody.
It is.
Okay, so we've covered the US, the EU, this global push for standardized reporting.
Yeah.
Where do things stand with the materiality question?
Yeah.
Is the U.S. likely to adopt the double materiality approach
the
EU is championing?
That's the million-dollar question.
Oh, tell me more.
And it's where things get really interesting.
This is where my brain starts to get a little fuzzy.
I hear you. It is a nuanced concept, but let me give you a concrete example to make it clearer.
Okay.
Let's say there's a tech company that uses a lot of cobalt in its batteries. They might be sourcing that cobalt from mines that have terrible labor practices.
Oh, that's awful.
Right, maybe even using child labor.
Yeah.
So under the single materiality approach that the U.S. currently uses, the company would only have to disclose that risk if it directly impacted their profits.
Okay.
So maybe if they faced a consumer boycott or legal trouble.
So it's all about their bottom line.
Exactly.
Okay.
But with double materiality, the company would have to disclose the fact that they're contributing to child labor regardless of whether it hurt their profits.
Because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, and because it acknowledges that businesses have a responsibility to consider their impact on society and the environment, not just their shareholders.
So where does the U.S. stand on this? Do you think they'll eventually shift towards this double materiality approach?
It's possible the EU is setting a precedent.
Right.
And as more companies start reporting on double materiality for the European market, it could start to influence practices elsewhere.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What about investors? Are they pushing for this kind of expanded disclosure?
Some definitely are, especially those that are focused on ESG. Environmental, social, and governance factors.
Got it.
They're realizing that companies that prioritize these issues are often better long-term investments.
So it sounds like this whole landscape of climate disclosure is still very much in flux.
It is. It's evolving rapidly.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of moving parts. But one thing is clear.
What is that?
Transparency is here to stay.
Transparency is here to stay.
It is.
And companies that try to bury their heads in the sand are going to be left behind.
Absolutely. The future belongs to those who are willing to be upfront about their climate impacts and their plans to address them.
We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
But before we move on, I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges that companies are facing as they navigate these new disclosure requirements?
That's a great question. A few key challenges come to mind.
Okay.
First off, just getting the data itself can be a huge obstacle.
Yeah.
A lot of companies, especially smaller ones, just don't have systems in place to track emissions accurately, let alone across their entire value chain.
It's not as simple as checking your Fitbit for your carbon footprint.
No, it's not.
Is it?
Not quite.
Okay.
Even when companies do have the data, making sense of it all and turning it into a meaningful report is another challenge altogether.
Yeah, it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be.
Especially for companies that haven't really been prioritizing sustainability.
Yeah, and then there's the cost factor.
Oh, yeah.
Hiring consultants, implementing new software, verifying those emissions numbers, it all adds up.
So are we talking about a significant financial burden?
It depends.
Or is it manageable for most companies?
It really depends on the company's size and complexity.
Okay.
For some, it could definitely strain resources.
Yeah.
Especially those with complex global supply chains.
I imagine there's a pretty steep learning curve, too.
Oh, yeah.
Just figuring out, what needs to be reported and how.
Absolutely. These regulations are complex. There are a lot of nuances.
Yeah.
It's not always straightforward, and companies are definitely having to invest time and effort to get up to speed.
And then there's the whole legal liability issue, too.
Right.
I know some companies are worried about getting sued over their disclosures.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
If companies make inaccurate or misleading statements in their climate disclosures, they could face legal action from investors or regulators.
So it's not just a matter of, checking boxes.
No.
And hoping for the best.
Yeah.
They really have to be thorough.
Exactly.
And make sure their data is solid.
Exactly. That's where the whole attestation and verification process comes in.
Right.
So the SEC rules, for instance, require independent verification of Scope 1 and 2 emissions data.
So it's like having an auditor come in and make sure your books are in order.
Perfect analogy.
But for your climate footprint.
Yes. It adds a layer of accountability.
Okay.
And it helps ensure that the data is accurate and reliable.
That's reassuring. But this all sounds pretty daunting.
It can be.
Especially for companies that are new to this whole climate reporting thing.
It can feel overwhelming, but remember, there is a lot of support available.
Okay.
Consultants specialize in this software can help with data collection and analysis. Industry groups are sharing best practices.
So companies aren't being thrown into the deep end without a life vest.
Not at all. And plus, it's important to remember the bigger picture. This is about driving progress towards a more sustainable future.
Yeah.
These disclosures are a tool for improvement, not a punishment.
Right. It's about pushing companies to do better.
Yes.
Not shaming them.
Exactly.
But besides being required to, why should companies want to embrace these new disclosures?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Beyond compliance, there are some serious advantages for companies that get this right.
Okay, let's hear it.
Yeah.
Convince those skeptical companies that this is good for them.
Okay, so for starters, these disclosures can be a huge boost for a company's reputation and brand image.
Because it shows that they're taking climate change seriously.
Exactly.
And being transparent about their efforts.
Consumers, especially younger generations, they want companies to be sustainable and responsible.
Okay.
And investors are paying attention too.
Yeah.
Companies with strong ESG performance are often seen as less risky and more attractive investments.
So it's not just about saving the planet.
Right.
It's about protecting their profits too.
It is.
Which is music to a CEO's ears.
Exactly. And beyond reputation, these disclosures can help companies attract and retain top talent.
Interesting. How so?
Well, top talent, particularly in fields like engineering and tech, they want to work for companies that are aligned with their values. Companies seen as leaders in sustainability have a competitive edge in attracting and keeping those highly sought-after employees.
So good for investors, good for potential hires. What else?
Well, there's the whole innovation piece. When companies are forced to scrutinize their operations and their environmental impact, it can spark new ideas and solutions.
Oh, interesting.
So they might find ways to reduce emissions, develop more sustainable products, or even create entirely new business models that are better for the planet.
So it becomes about finding opportunities to solve the problem.
Exactly.
Not just reporting on it.
This shift towards transparency can be a catalyst for positive change, both within companies and across entire industries.
That's a great point. It's not just about compliance, it's about transformation.
Exactly. And the companies that embrace that transformation are the ones that will thrive in the long run.
Okay, you've made a very strong case.
I've tried.
For why companies should really get on board with climate disclosure.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what are the key things companies need to do to succeed in this new era of transparency?
I'd say there are a few crucial steps. First and foremost, they need to get their data house in order.
Right.
That means having robust systems in place to track emissions accurately and consistently. Okay.
No more fuzzy math or guesstimates.
So the days of greenwashing are over.
I think they are.
Yeah.
Investors and regulators are going to be digging deep.
Yeah.
And companies need to be prepared to back up their claims.
And even though Scope 3 emissions aren't mandatory everywhere yet, you were saying earlier, it's probably a smart idea to just start tracking them anyway.
I think it's a good idea to start now.
Yeah.
The pressure to disclose that information is only going to grow.
It sounds like untangling a giant knot, though.
It can be.
Where do you even begin with Scope 3?
It can feel overwhelming, but there are tools and approaches to help.
Okay.
One strategy is to focus on what are called the hot spots in their value chain.
Okay.
So the suppliers or activities that generate the most emissions.
Okay.
Prioritizing those areas can make the biggest impact.
So data is key, but it's not just about the numbers, right?
Right.
Companies also need a clear strategy for addressing their climate risks and impacts. You're exactly right. Investors want to see action, not just data.
Yeah.
They want to know how companies are managing climate-related risks.
Yeah.
How they're reducing emissions and what their plans are for transitioning to a low-carbon future.
So it's not enough to just say, hey, we're measuring our emissions.
Right.
They need to have a plan to actually do something about it.
Exactly. And that plan needs to be credible, specific, and measurable.
Okay.
Companies need to set clear targets, outline their strategies, and track their progress over time.
And it sounds like transparency is key here.
Yeah.
They need to be willing to share their successes, but also their challenges and setbacks.
Absolutely. Authenticity is crucial.
Yeah.
Investors and consumers are savvy.
For sure.
They can spot BS from a mile away.
Yeah.
Companies that are honest and transparent about their journey will build trust and credibility.
And ultimately, that trust and credibility is what will matter most.
It is.
So if we could distill all of this down to one key piece of advice for companies navigating this new era of climate disclosure, what would it be?
Embrace it.
Embrace it.
See this as an opportunity, not a burden.
Okay.
It's a chance to build a more sustainable and resilient business, strengthen your reputation, attract top talent, and innovate for a better future.
Yeah.
The companies that lead on climate transparency are the ones that will thrive in the long run.
Well said. And on that note, it's time to wrap up our deep dive into mandatory climate disclosures.
It is a fascinating topic.
It is a fascinating topic, and we've covered a lot, but as always, there is so much more to explore.
There's always more.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this evolving landscape.
Yes.
What aspects of climate disclosures are you most curious about? Let us know, and maybe we'll deep dive into it in a future episode.
That's right.